today we've operated at a number of different speeds, different modes, different approaches. We've had moral, spiritual, political activist and scientific economic inputs, and it's my great privilege now to introduce Professor John Vogler. John is Professorial Research Fellow in International Relations at Keele. I had the privilege of hearing him at Hope University, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, and he spoke in the business school. And I have not kept up contact with John, but it was a wonderful time when John came and spoke at Hope a few years ago. So we're really privileged to have you back with us, John. John is convener of the BISA Environment Working Group, sometime member of the ESRC Centre for Climate Economics and Policy, and author of Climate Change in World Politics, plus a myriad of other publications. And so it's great to have you with us, John, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen first, see if I can do this properly. There we go. Share. It seems to work. Okay. Okay, slide that. Okay. Before I start, it's very humbling to have to start a presentation after what we've just heard. So I thought I'd just add something to it, which is pretty minor, but I hope indicative. That is to say, you may not know that amongst all the other dimensions of the Archbishop's life, he was also at one point an international football manager, managed an international team. And I saw him then because this happened just down the road from here at Stoke City Stadium, where he was involved in a celebratory match, which I think was to celebrate the life of local hero Stanley Matthews, football hero Stanley Matthews. And he was manager of a World 11. He was the coach manager of a World 11, which was playing an old England 11, which was actually managed by Gordon Banks, the ex-England goalkeeper, who sadly dead himself now. But I cannot remember what the score was in this match. But the one thing I do remember is the manager of the World 11 and the sheer radiant, life-affirming enthusiasm which he brought to all of these events. And that's the man I remember. I'm sure many other people do. So there you go. It's another dimension. So my topic for today is climate justice at COP26. And I want to try and put COP26 in some sort of perspective going forward. I also want to make a fundamental point, I think, right at the beginning, that in terms of development and North-South politics, the climate convention and its COPs and all its other meetings and its intersessional meetings is of primary importance for developing countries. And in particular, the importance of adaptation and loss and damage alongside our endless discussion of the mitigation of climate change has often been underestimated in the West, I think, and in the North. So I'm going to talk about that aspect. Of course, I'm going to talk about mitigation as well, but I want to talk in particular to stress adaptation and loss and damage and its relationship to mitigation. And I'm going to want to do it. My title is Climate Justice. Now, I could spend all of my session and more debating with you exactly what this means, climate justice. There are many different interpretations of it, and I'm going to deal with one or two. The first one I'd like to think about is the rather simple distinction between procedural justice and substantive justice. In terms of procedural justice, the fair treatment of everybody in the system, the Climate Convention is very important. because it does take, or has taken, I think, procedural justice very seriously, right from the beginning, when one of the relatively few things that are in the original convention is the importance of capacity building. The ability of states with very limited resources to take part in discussions at all when they have a limited range of people who have the expertise to participate, and they're up against vast delegations full of technical expertise in the developed world. So that's been very important. And also, I think, after Copenhagen, when there was clearly what one might describe as the stitch up right at the end between the Obama administration, the Chinese and others, and everybody else felt very left out. There was a huge reaction to this. And ever since, the COP and the intersessional meetings have been dominated, I think, by demands for a party-driven process, which means that everybody has to have their say. And this is the case, and it often makes negotiations extremely long-winded and difficult, but they are a party-driven process. And I think this is quite rare in international organization. We were talking about the WTO before, the stasis of the WTO, and I could mention a range of other international organizations that are in no way as democratic. I mean, it's very difficult to talk of democracy between states, but I think you can see the point I'm making. It is a democratic organization when very small states, particularly small underdeveloping states, have a disproportionate influence over proceedings and get to talk to the big boys, if you see what I mean. So I think this was evident at Glasgow. And the other dimension, of course, which relates to something else we were talking about this morning, is the extent to which the processes are open to the non-governmental sector. And of course, there are important connections between the non-government, between NGOs and developing states in terms of putting their case forward and participating fully in the COP. So procedural justice is pretty important. Now, if I can turn first of all, in terms of substantive justice, my other concept of substantive distributional justice, which concerns responsibility for the climate problem and the distribution of costs and benefits. On the screen, you can see the historic cumulative emissions. And clearly, it's impossible to deny that certain countries have a huge historic responsibility for the presence of long-lasting greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere. The problem, of course, is managing this. How do we embody responsibility, historic responsibility, in what we do now about reducing emissions? So this is a key issue. Who should bear the costs? Who should take action? And recognition of this comes very early on in the development in the International Negotiating Committee, which actually formulated the Climate Change Convention before it was signed in 1992. And interestingly, and I think it's very interesting to note, that the developed countries, particularly the European Union, the United States, were prepared to put a principle into the convention, which of course is the famous CBDRRC principle about collective responsibility. And so under the CBDR principle and collective responsibility and respective capabilities, it is, of course, the developed countries who acknowledge that it is their responsibility to take the first move. And that was the case. And it was developed, of course, in the Kyoto Protocol, where the world was divided into the Annex 1 and 2 countries, that is the developed countries, particularly the Annex 2 countries, and the rest. And it was the developed countries, of course, who had to who committed themselves to emissions reductions under the Kyoto Protocol. Now, as we know, Kyoto was not wildly successful, not successful at all, we can debate that. But the question almost immediately arose when it was clear that the developing countries would soon be the major emitters of carbon dioxide because of the fast development of the economies of China and India. It became very clear that, that the old principle of separating, of differentiating the developed from the developing countries would no longer be possible in terms of mitigation. Now, the argument continued as to exactly who should be involved in mitigation, because the Indians, for example, argue, and they still argue, that if we have a certain amount of, if to stay within 2 degrees centigrade, we have a certain amount of carbon space available, a certain amount of carbon we continue to emit. As you can see from this graphic, we in the developed countries, the Annex 1 countries, have already emitted far more than our share if you have a fair entitlement on a per capita basis across countries, whereas China and India and other non-annex countries haven't used up anything like what would be a proportionate share of their carbon space. And as the Indians point out, carbon space is also development space. So there is a central problem in terms of emissions reduction when it comes to allocating historic responsibility and deciding who is going to do what. The other problem, of course, is the distribution of per capita emissions by country. I mean, the previous slide was all about emissions by country. But if you, hang on, go back. Oops, I want to go back. Previous. I'm going back.
I think you just need to keep pressing previous, John.
I'll keep pressing previous. Ah, there we are. Okay, let's try and.
Yeah, if you find the
slide. Go from the beginning again, okay?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm having problems with my computer. The issue is that you not only need to look at things by country, but you also, if you're concerned in any way with justice, have to look at distributions within countries and of per capita distributions. And not only that, you have to be aware of the fact that even in large developing countries like India, there are very large numbers of people who individually have very substantial carbon emissions. There's also the problem of the way in which the COP distributes emissions. Now, the COP is based upon national territorial emissions. The Climate Change Convention is based upon national territorial emissions. And of course, as I think we heard earlier this morning, it is the case that for a country like Britain, many of what were historically our emissions related to production, consumption emissions, have been transferred elsewhere. And the way in which the climate change regime is set up doesn't really take this into account. So there are a whole range of problems associated with trying to have a just solution in relation to mitigation. So in Paris in 2015, moving away from the Kyoto system, you introduce a universal obligation to make emissions reductions. Now, the principle of electric and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities was further modified before Paris when the Chinese insisted, if they were going to sign up to this, of adding text in the light of different national circumstances. And you will notice if you look in the Paris agreement, there is no mention of the annexes and the differentiation between North and South. So in one sense, what you've got in Paris is a system which is universal. It had to be universal, really, because it's developing countries who are going to have most of the emissions in the future. But there are subtle differences, particularly which are written into the text, which mean that developing countries still have lesser obligations in some respects in that text than the developed do. So there is the 2020 regime. As I say, the post-2020 regime is set up in Paris. The key point, it is comprehensive. There is no longer this fundamental distinction between Annex 1 and 2 countries and the rest. The second point to make, of course, is that these are contributions, not commitments. They're contributions, not commitments. That is to say, they're essentially voluntaristic, whereas under the Kyoto Protocol, there were commitments. And the system is supposed to work as a kind of bottom-up pledge and review system, rather than the more tightly organized, the more binding system that you have under Kyoto. The other point I'd like to make about Paris is that for the first time, I think, there is some parity between mitigation and adaptation. Now, this is something that the developing countries were always very keen to have and fought over for a long time, to the Bali COP, for example. And I think one of the things they would say about Paris was that for the first time, adaptation, although it had been in the original climate change convention, gets parity of recognition with mitigation. So we move forward now, I think, to exactly what has transpired in Glasgow in relation to the development of the Paris Agreement. Again, in terms of mitigation, the famous final change in the text, whereby India and China, two big developing countries, called the two big developing countries, forced a revision of the original text from phasing out to phasing down their unabated coal power, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. As you may know, everybody commented at the time, this was actually the first time at the COP that anybody had actually formally mentioned coal. We can discuss this later, but it seems to me that one of the things we might have done right at the beginning would be to have, rather than a broadly based climate agreement, an agreement that was involved in phasing out coal. Nevertheless, we should have maybe done that 30 years ago. The other key North-South issue, I think, that was debated in Glasgow was the vexed question of Article 6, trading under Article 6. Glasgow finalised the rules. One of the achievements of the Glasgow COP was actually to finalise the rule book on carbon trading. Carbon trading, as you may recall, was one of the principal mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol. And there were some credits, clean development mechanism credits, that have been left over. One of the key issues that was still being debated right up to the end of the COP was how many of these old ancient legacy credits will be allowed in future carbon trading. One of the other key issues was the extent to which REDD+, that is credits based upon maintaining forests, putting money into maintaining forests, should be included not only in carbon offsetting, but also within the countries, the way in which countries were able to present their efforts in relation to the nationally determined contributions under the Paris system. There's also the issue of whether there was going to be any relationship between this carbon trading system and adaptation funding. That's something for which the African countries in particular were very, very strongly supportive, and it didn't happen, as we shall see. The agreement on carbon trading basically meant that although the EU and the United States, who were the people who were likely to buy carbon under the credits under the carbon trading system, they were very opposed, first of all, to the usage of old carbon credits, but also to having forestry credits included, because they were regarded not as bona fide international traded transfer of mitigation obligations. And they were also opposed to having any formal link, direct link between some of the receipts of carbon trading being put into an adaptation fund. These were bitterly disputed issues towards the end of COP26, and at one point threatened to hold the whole thing up. So carbon trading, very significant. But there are other things as well at Paris, in particular adaptation and loss and damage. Now, Paris says that there are to be, that there is to be adaptation, action and support. It also talks about loss and damage under Article 8. And the critical issue here had been for a long time in terms of adaptation funding, and this was much reported in the press, whether the pledge, which is a very old pledge, I think it goes back virtually to Copenhagen, of 100 billion per annum funding for adaptation, whether that will be achieved. It certainly wasn't achieved by COP26. The promise was made at COP26 that it would be achieved by 2023. There's a great deal of skepticism about this, of course. But what did happen at COP26 following the text in Paris about adaptation was a pledge to double adaptation funding from a 2019 base, and a voluntary 356 million funding to the adaptation fund. I must say, in terms of the pledges, the adaptation pledges made at Glasgow, these are pretty minor in terms of the scale of the problem. Most of that sum actually is being made by the EU, by the Commission and the member states of the EU, the 356 million that was pledged. Right at the end of the COP, John Kerry said, "You've got to trust us. Please sign up to this agreement," the Glasgow text. He was talking to the Glasgow Pact. He was talking to the developing countries. "You've got to trust us. We have a moral obligation to fulfill this." That's what John Kerry said. Whether it will transpire or not is entirely another matter. So one of the big issues is adaptation funding, and essentially the Glasgow achievements were pretty minimal. A couple of other things I can say about adaptation. Mitigation is pretty well defined and quantified in the Climate Change Convention, but adaptation isn't. And one of the things they've set themselves to do in 2 years is actually to come up with a proper definition of what adaptation might mean. I have to say this is of very great significance to many developing countries. We can't, because they are already spending what? I have seen figures for African countries that they're spending between 7 to 9% of their governmental budget on dealing with the effects of actually occurring climate change. So this is significant stuff. And if you read the final text at Glasgow, the final text reads that they note with deep regret the failure to achieve the 100 billion and hope to move forward to actually getting this done and to having a proper definition of adaptation. As I've said, a key issue throughout the history, I think, of the Climate Change Convention is the imbalance between our concern with mitigation on the one hand and concern with adaptation on the other. The other key issue is loss and damage. Now, loss and damage has been an issue of growing importance in the climate change regime. Basically, it means that aside from adaptation, there is also a requirement, even a moral obligation, for developed states who are essentially responsible for the climate problem to pay for the damage that is being done, particularly to small, weak developing states. There is a loss and damage provision. It's mentioned in Paris and it is debated. But what the developed countries won't do is to accept the idea of climate reparations. That is absolute. They won't go there. They will not talk about a financial obligation, ongoing financial obligation to pay for the damage that has been done by climate change. The one country that did do it is the Scottish government, which in the middle of the COP26 broke this taboo by actually pledging some money to loss and damage. What they did agree to do was to fund a network of technical advice, the so-called Santiago network. And just like in adaptation, they're saying we will have a continuing dialogue, promised, we're going to have a continuing dialogue on loss and damage. But I have to stress that a red line for the developed countries, for the EU and the US and the others, is that they will not entertain the idea of climate reparations or liability. At the last slide, I'll be glad to hear my problems moving from slide to slide. I just want to talk in the end about the politics of all this. I think there is an overall agreement now that there is common fate interdependence, that this is a problem we all have to face, and it's got more and more serious. Everybody knows that. But the countries and blocs concerned obviously pursue their shorter term energy and financial interests. It's very easy to talk about net zero out to 2050, but you've got also to deal with your immediate problems in the next decade. And of course, those are critical if we are ever to stay anywhere near the 1.5 target. The developing world operates under the general umbrella of the G77 China. But within that, and that of course is their key negotiating group, the UN, but within that, there are major subgroups that have very, very divergent interests. You've only got to think of the one hand of the OPEC oil producing countries, which are also developing countries, some of them, and on the other hand, AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, for whom climate change is a vital national survival, because they know if you go beyond 1.5, many are going to cease to exist. I mean, Mia Motley, the impressive head of the government of the Barbados, talked about this being a suicide pact unless something is done about that. Then you've got in Latin America, ILAC, which are the one group of Latin American countries are quite positive, in Costa Rica, who are pretty positive about doing things about climate. And then there's the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, which has an entirely different view. Then, of course, you've got the big emitters in the south. That is to say, you've got BASIC, you've got Brazil, the BASIC group, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And they, as we have seen on mitigation obligations in coal, have their own development requirements. And they want to protect their development space. Whereas the African group are worried about immediate adaptation costs. They're worried about their budget next year and the need for financing. Whereas you've got rainforest nations, and this was particularly an issue over REDD in the carbon trading negotiations, want to have forest credits included for obvious reasons. Now, clearly there was a lot of unhappiness at the end game of COP26, not only over what India and China did, but over the failure to deal with these long outstanding questions of adaptation funding and loss and damage. The African group at one point said, we are not signing this. We simply can't do this. It's a red line for us, the failure of adaptation funding. And it seems that in the end, and this often seems to happen at the end of COPs, they were persuaded to sign up very, very reluctantly on the basis of promises made by John Kerry and others, but also because the small island developing states, the alliance of small island states said, look, we have to have this process going forward. It must go forward, and therefore you shouldn't block it. But the problem is, of course, again, you've got a whole set of promises that may not be fulfilled. I suppose in the end, the African states and IOSIS were not prepared to sink the whole Glasgow Pact over issues relating to REDD+ and a lack of adaptation funding. So that is where it stands, I'm afraid. It looks to me that the outcomes of COP26 are quite familiar in terms of what's happened to the number of other some of the COPs before that. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the Americans can fulfill Kerry's moral obligation, and there will be massive development funding. I don't know. Will that even be adequate? I mean, the other problem that I'm very much struck by is that an ex-student here is now the High Commissioner of the Maldives. And we had a discussion with her a few months ago prior to COP26. And she said, well, the problem really for us is not so much that the funding doesn't exist, that it won't exist, but it's very, very difficult to get hold of it and actually get it onto the ground. That is to say, we have these debates about how much funding there's going to be and how it's allocated between governments, multinational development banks, etc., private and public sector. But looked at from the perspective of an individual developing state, it's not only that, it's the question of actually getting hold of this money and using it on the ground in a timely and effective manner. And she was talking 3 to 5 years. So that's a thing that they didn't even talk about alongside a number of other things at the COP. And I think that's increasingly going to be a big issue going forward. So I hope they manage to define adaptation funding properly. I hope there is they develop the mechanism in relation to loss and damage. But one cannot be sure. One certainly can't be sure about what will happen with the United States. It's all very well for Kerry to end the COP with saying you can be assured America has a moral obligation, as he did say, to G77 China. But who knows, given the state of what will happen in the American Congress and so on. So that's some little insight into the politics of COP26. My own view is it keeps, as you say, it keeps the show on the road as it often does, but it tends to kick the can down the road as well. Thanks very much. Apologies for my problems with the slides.